Thank you all for coming. My name is Charlie Erdman. I am hailing from Boulder, Colorado. So the West is representing, sort of. Do we have, or most of the people I assume are from the southern region. Do we have anybody from the Northeast? Okay, one or two hands going up. Do we have anybody from West Coast or the West? Oh, look at that. Okay, good. So I get to now speak for the entire West Coast. This is awesome. No one can correct me. I've been involved with design for the last 20 years, primarily in the digital space. So I started out in '94, coding for the first web browser that came out, Netscape, and then evolved to be something called user experience. So my next question for the audience is, how many people are designers in the audience? Or a fair amount. We have people on both sides of the aisle. And then how many people are developers? Good. And then who is a startup kind of founder, has an idea, came to the conference to develop and think more about the trajectory they're on right now? Awesome. There we go. So that gives, I think, a good sense of there's a healthy amount of people in the audience that clearly know what user experience design is. User experience design, just to give you kind of a little bit of a quick history, started out, we had to make it up. We borrowed from industrial design, graphic design, library sciences, and it was about the organization of information in these huge new virtual worlds we talk. And now we talk about virtual reality in a very different way. But at the time, these digital landscapes where we had huge amounts of information that needed to be structured in a way that was intuitive to navigate, move through, and comprehend, or else it was worthless. It just became data. There's that whole model where you talk about data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. So on that spectrum, right, we were trying to make it so at least it was information, and at best we could actually make it so it created a knowledge where you started seeing patterns that could be replicated. That was called information architecture, and that still is a term that's used today. Now we're calling it user experience because as people move from digital screens back into their lives, the statistics on how many times people check their mobile phone in a day is staggering. And it's frightening, actually, in my opinion. As a designer of these experiences, where I have been instructed to do things like engagement, captive, right? These are words where we're basically trying to grab your attention, hold it for as long as possible, knowing we live in a society that's ADD, and we're responsible for that ADD as designers. So whether we like it or not, in design, we are taking on big cultural issues. And we have to remember that with your design of a product, a service, or communication, you're wading into territory that is fraught with politically charged, culturally charged issues. So here's some examples. Gender, race, economic status, geography. Those all come with assumptions and bias, right? Here I am from the West Coast coming to the South. I could have a huge bag full of biases and assumptions about what the South represents. Is it true? Maybe, maybe not. But they're stereotypes that have been propagated by the culture that lives around me. And so all of us on teams of people have to be willing to confront these issues of bias, because all of us everybody on your team is biased, whether you like to think that or not. You're biased as a founder or designer. And so design and the process of design is meant to challenge those assumptions, validate our assumptions, and so we can make a better product that is actually more useful and is free of those. So I'll give you an extreme example before we start going into the panelists, and I'll introduce them. Artificial intelligence is not on the horizon. It is right now happening in all of our pockets and in all of our lives. So imagine artificial intelligence that has the wrong bias. So a medical application that is biased one way or another towards or away from somebody, and now is making decisions for you as a convenience, as a way of making it so that a process is faster, so it can give doctors or insurance companies the ability to quickly scan huge databases of information and find patterns of relevance. These are very, very important issues, and design plays a key central role to this world. So the talk today is going to be about bias and how ultimately you and I and these panelists can create designs that are absent of as much bias as we can pull out, of stereotypes, of assumptions, of judgments, all of that. So to introduce our panel, we have a variety of different UX designers and UX researchers. They have a number of different skill sets, as most UX folks do. And so we have Olivia Rado, who is from an agency in Atlanta right now. She's a UX designer. And I'll go into, actually, let me pull out my notes because I have a couple. I don't want to miss an important. Okay, so Elizabeth Rado, currently UX designer at Launch Interactive in Atlanta, specializing in service and interactive design. She graduated from GSU with a BFA in printmaking. Yeah, accurate? Okay, good. Alyssa Greenman is a user experience designer at Gulfstream. She specializes in mobile applications that are in service of the sales representatives, engineers, and pilots. She has a master's in human factors psychology from Embry-Riddle Aeronautic University. We also have Christopher Villa, who has doctor in front of his name. You don't have doctor in front of your name, right? Okay, just making sure here. So we can call it doctor. We have two doctors in the house. Dr. Villa is the president and lead human factors engineer for Avesca, with a focus on physical and virtual product design. He has a master's in human factors and system engineering and a PhD in human factors from Embry-Riddle. So these are type of degrees that did not exist, by the way, 20 years ago, when my generation was kind of making this up. And so it's great now that it's becoming more and more formalized and structured so that all of the learnings that have happened over the last 20 years can boost us and take us into the next 20, 50 years. So we're going to do a little bit of an unusual kind of structure to this session where each one of the designers, user research experts, UX people are going to do a quick presentation on a project that they've been involved with, and inside that project they were challenging certain notions and assumptions of both the team or a marketplace or even just a technology. And so what we're going to try and do, and I know I'm taking up a lot of time talking to introduce, but I wanted to set the stage about what this conference was, or this panel would be about. So each presentation will be about 10 minutes, and then I'll just sort of ask a couple questions in between to hopefully spur on some dialogue, and we'll try and get a little Q&A at the end. One quick disclaimer before we start. Some of the project samples are from client work, so they don't represent the opinions of those clients, et cetera. Just imagine all the legal disclaimer I could utter right now, but I'm not a lawyer, but just say that's a disclaimer. So that frees us up to talk openly about some of these projects. So without further ado, we'll introduce Olivia Rado and take it away.
Oh, right. Got it. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today and showing the support of user experience design, because it plays a huge role in the systems that are a part of our everyday life, from taking Lyft to actually having a job. You know, it's a huge part of our economy, so it's awesome to play a role in that. So my project is content preview within a chatbot. It is exactly as it sounds. You're looking at a chatbot and you're using that to answer a question. And it sounds pretty simple. It's assumably simple with good reason. Upon further research, though, there are a lot of things to discuss. So first off, who's familiar with wireframes and the concept of an MVP? Okay, great. So for those of you that aren't familiar, wireframes are the digital blueprint of what a system would look like, how it would interact, and it has annotations in it so that the developers and stakeholders looking back on it can understand how it works. It's pretty black and white. It can have a lot of detail, but for the purpose of this presentation, I want it to be relatable, and so mine are pretty basic. And then an MVP is just meeting those basic deliverables in terms of what's most appropriate for the project or what you're essentially told to do. And those can be two different things. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Matchbook and the design problem. This is the chatbot. On one side, you have the customer who asks the question. In this case, I like to call the user a customer because that is exactly what they are. They have bought a product or an enterprise system, and they have a question specifically relating to that. And so when they come to Matchbook, they are looking to get a very specific answer. And so all of these answers are, this is why he's called Matchbook, squeezed onto the back of a matchbook. It's tons of information compressed through tons of teams and tons of effort to make it look simple for the user or the customer and to give them the answer that they're looking for in an efficient manner. So this is the digital ecosystem that Matchbook lives in. There are tons of environments supporting this tiny little Matchbook. And he does a great job delivering, but he's still learning how to support the customer. He still has that back-end integration that's happening. So anytime a customer asks a question, the chatbot actually thinks about it, sends that information up to IBM Watson in the cloud, and then that information is processed, sent back to the back end, and then processed to show the user the answer. Oh, here we go. So within this situation here, the chatbot is answering with a content preview. These are content cards. This is the current state template used within various parts of that digital ecosystem. So when the stakeholders handed off this project to me, they said, hey, this template is already being used. We'll save time on the back end, and it's appropriate for the user because it's successful in other places. But is this appropriate for the site that it's on currently within Matchbook? Does it feel like a lot of information? Is an image actually relevant? And so as a UX designer, I did a bunch of digging around a lot of corners, turned over all the stones, and worked with a really great team to answer all the questions that I had in terms of what is the most appropriate MVP for this. Assumably, from a stakeholder's perspective, this was it. Take what already exists, be consistent for the user, and save time and effort. But is that really what's best in terms of answering these customer questions efficiently? So these are the three types of content that the inline links are representing within the chatbot. We have a forums, a troubleshooting, and an articles. And so these are abbreviated wireframes of the current state links, inline links that drive to that browser view. And so as you can assume, all of that content is very, very site specific. You know, there might be a right rail on all three of these pages, but it's specific to that page. It's specific to that article. Those CTAs on a troubleshooting article are not the same as an error. So here's a current state edge case at the time current state. Matchbook has presented 5 inline links. If you're a customer and you're looking for an answer, you have to scan through that. You have to assume what those titles actually mean. You open the browser and you're like, I don't know if that was it. I wish I could have learned more about it before going into it. And those little interactions, especially if you're looking for an answer, they add up. I mean, it's like redesigning your kitchen, right? Like there's tons of things that you look at, but you really just want the answer. And it should be simple, especially because you bought the product. So in doing a little bit more research, I created a requirements document just to keep track of what's in scope and what's out of scope. Always put notes next to it, be able to back up those design decisions. It sounds really simple, but after you do the audit of all the content on those 3 types of sites, and each one has a different format as well, like there's edge cases within those 3 landing pages, that's the audit on the bottom. That's a ton of information. So do you feel like that is actually fitting for the current state template? Anybody? All right, so I did some more digging and I learned that Google Analytics was not actually being used for the chatbot. but it was being used on the pages being resourced as the inline hyperlinks. And so I had to learn a new analytics program. The project was due within a week and a half. It was a really fast sprint. So I got to work with the data analytics team, and that was really interesting to learn how the information is caught, what are the current, like how is it currently being used, but more specifically, what is it telling us? We know that failed interactions within Matchbook lead to more interactions, and we want to diminish those interactions because it's time and it's effort for the user and on the back end. It's costly, so we want to help minimize that. And so that's the whole idea behind putting a content card. Yeah, so exploration. Document what works and what doesn't work. I mean, create those matrices, create a requirements document, take notes, follow up with your stakeholders for what those takeaways are, but also kind of help lead them, show them why maybe that idea isn't as relevant as they thought it was. And so this is exploration in terms of how content can inform those interactions, right? But also to validate, for an initial version of expanding this inline hyperlink, what's the best way to present that information and to do so efficiently? So here we have a content preview card. There's an image, there's a title, there's a button on the top right to preview and open that up, and then it pushes to a browser view. And that's just a box on top of a box on top of a box. It's a lot of clicking, that's a lot of content. Is that actually necessary? And so in showing what doesn't work, you're also validating what would work. And especially as an MVP, like you don't want to just charge forward. You want to be cautious, you want to be strategic, you want to be in line with those other big picture goals. And so that's really what this project is about.
I'm going to interrupt you because that's a really good point. I hope you got that. Showing what doesn't work, you start to show what does work. That's one of the biggest pieces of UX design. When you start getting boxes and squares on a piece of paper or on a screen, you start to be able to have collaborative conversations, right? And to have the ability for other people to weigh in and see some of the assumptions they may have made about what they thought was a simple assignment may have a lot more complexity than people originally assumed. So I'm going to interject on these really good points that are about the bias, et cetera.
And that's a huge theme in UX. Every project I'm on, and that is more and more true. So yeah, thank you. So this is another exploration. What if for those edge cases where there's 5, instead of stacking 5 cards in a carousel, what if it was a list with the title and then that expanded to another box that actually had that preview card? But at the same time, you're still creating more interaction. And why do I need to look for it when you could just show me?
And Olivia, sorry to interrupt, but we only have about another 2 minutes.
Okay.
So I really want you to also, as you're going through these, think about the screens that start to tell the story of where maybe your team had assumptions about the data and the project, and how you may have started to illuminate some of the considerations.
Okay. So on these content cards, we know that they don't work. We know that you should just be able to click on the title and go directly to the browser view. You also know that you don't necessarily need a CTA image when the content is more important. So I think we understand that at this point. Without further ado, this is the final solution. And troubleshooting an article, I was able to design a template for the 2. And then we expanded the scope of the project to include related links within the body of those 2 pieces of content, because it actually is relevant. There's a maximum of 3 links. And that pushed the scope of the project, but it's relevant for the customer. And at the end of the day, that's the goal. And then the bottom article is forums, which includes a hyperlink, the original post or question, and then the verified answer or solution, or the one with the most votes. So here it is in context. You have the title, which you can click on to browser view. You have your content, you have your carousel, but you also have the ability to ask the customer if that card was even relevant. Because the bot is still learning, you need to know if it doesn't work, and we're more likely to know when it doesn't work and receive feedback on that than when it does work, because the data isn't set up to follow and add a survey on the hyperlink on that web page. So what happens when the user presses no? I've already read this article is off topic, this article doesn't solve my problem, this content wasn't helpful. So just following up and actually getting a specific answer will help the data team build that platform in an efficient way.
That's a great point. I like to say to my teams, we don't want any dead ends with any experience, right? So where a customer gets someplace and they don't know what to do next. That's one type of dead end. The other type of dead end is a conversation that just falls off. So in this case, a conversation has occurred, right? And now you're actually tying up a loose end. Hey, how was that for you? I think it's a great point.
Mm-hmm. And so what happens when the links are of equal value, instead of presenting cards, just present the title and the button. And this is a format that had taken place within other aspects of the product and the initiative for the long-term goals. So I was on this project for 3.5 weeks, but I was on a variety of other projects leading into the MVP interactions of how content informs interaction efficiently. So what are my takeaways? Bookmarks are my best friend. I looked at so much content in order to be specific and count all the edge cases that I became really OCD in how I organized my bookmarks, and I'm really glad that I did that because I didn't have to use my brain space. I could use my computer space to do that. Also, it's healthy to be curious. Use that to cover your ass. Use that to answer questions. Always be nice about it, and if you explain it from the sake of curiosity, you're always going to get the answers that you need. Also, every project teaches you something new. Like, just because I've done a bunch of UX projects doesn't mean that the next project doesn't have something to teach me. It always does. There's always that learning curve, and I love it. And also say thank you. The team that I worked with was remote. It wasn't always easy, and I worked with really awesome people, and I'm really glad for that. So thank you for being here on that note.
Thank you very much, Olivia. That was great. I like those. Nice 4 points at the end to tie it up. I like it. Yeah. Cool. Well, the next we have Alyssa Greenman, the Gulfstream UX designer. And she'll bring us another, there we go. We have some Gulfstream people in the house, I gather. Yeah.
In case you need to contact Olivia.
There we go. And also, if you do want to contact anybody, I assume that's all on the Geekend website. So.
Okay. So, like mentioned, my name's Alyssa Greenman. I'm a user experience designer at Gulfstream. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the Options mobile application, which is a project that we worked on over the last couple of years. So here's a screenshot from the app. So imagine that you just bought your first Gulfstream. Oh yeah.
I'm imagining.
Everything on a Gulfstream is customizable. So that's a lot to deal with when you're a customer. You don't know what all of the things that you can choose are. So our completions representatives had a ton of different papers. They had pictures, but not everyone had the same pictures. So they asked us to create this app to bring everything together in a consistently branded manner, and that way everyone has the same photos, the same descriptions of all the different options. So one of the things in the app is that we have a list of categories and a list of selections. So when you tap on a category, the selections for that category show up. The categories and the different selections were provided to us by the customer. That was our first assumption, was that those made sense to everyone. Come to find out, one person created those and everyone else was dealing with it. So in our first usability test, we asked the representatives to find the item that they're looking for, find a specific item in the app. They couldn't do it. They were jumping between a bunch of different categories before finally figuring out where it was. So that's a big problem, because when our representatives are meeting with the customers, we don't want the customer to think that our representatives don't know what they're talking about, and we also don't want our representatives to feel like they don't know what they're talking about. We don't want them to have that sense of embarrassment or a bad interaction with the customer because they can't find an item that was asked about. So we decided to do a card sort. And a card sort is a great way to figure out what's the best way to organize the information that you have. So if you have a bunch of content and you don't know where it should go or how it should be organized for your users, a card sort is a great way to do that. So what we did was we placed one selection, so one specific selection from the app on each card, and we asked the representatives to sort them in a way that made sense to them. So you can do this with actual physical cards, or you can do it online. So those representatives happen to travel a lot, so it made the most sense for us to do an online sort. We didn't give them a specific number of groups. You can if you want to. And we also didn't give them group names. We asked them to name the groups themselves. Again, this is an option that you have when you're doing your own card sort. You can give them group names, but depending on how sure you are of what those groups are, it may be best to start with an open sort, which is what we did, where there's no groups, there's no names, and you just have them do what they want. If you are considering doing a card sort on your own, highly recommend reading the Card Sorting by Donna Spencer. It's one of the best practical guides out there for getting started on your own. She talks a lot about different ways to analyze your data and just how to get started on your own. So our results specifically, we ended up with 8 participants, which was about a third of the user base, which is really good. You can usually not expect that high level of participation, so that's nice for us. A dendrogram, sometimes you'll see it without the R, dendogram. It's just a tree diagram, which is what you're seeing there on the right. So if we're looking at this, the far right side would be if every single selection was in the same group. That doesn't help us. The far left side, you can imagine a list of all the different selections on the left. That would be if every single selection was in its own group. Again, that doesn't really help us. So where the tree diagram starts to get very valuable is in the middle there. So where you can see, depending on how far left you go, you'd be getting more and more groups. So the middle area is where you want to start looking for your actual groups that you're going to use for your system. We use the best merge method. There's other types of methods, but if you have less than 30 participants, which again we had 8, that's the best way. It'll kind of start to predict what more users would have done had they done your study. There's a lot of different software packages you can use for this. There's Optimal Sort by Optimal Workshop, or you can just use Excel or SPSS. I have to tell you that Gulfstream does not endorse any of these projects. We happen to use Optimal Sort for this particular project. One of the things that they also offer in that system is this participant-centric analysis. So it gives you the way that each participant sorted the cards, and then how many of the other participants agreed with that person. And then it also gives you alternatives for the group names that that person chose. So for example, if we have one person named the category communication, another person named it connectivity. So it gives us a few different options for when we're going to name the categories ourselves later. It tells us how close are the users in what they're calling this group.
And that's a really good point. I will stop right
Sure.
there, because even on our call, we talked a little bit about this. Labeling, titles, we talk about bias right there. When you are taking the taxonomy and you have a category that is encompassing of so many elements, that title has to project out what people anticipate, what people would expect is behind it. So that's a really hard exercise. Even separate from this card sorting is what you call these categories that will be in your navigation. Someone needs to be able to look at that navigation and quickly understand that I'm seeing my need in that title. So that's a really important point I just wanted to call out quickly.
Sure. So what you're seeing here is before and after of the different categories. One of the things that we found out during this study was that the categories were actually not in a great order for the users. So when our representative sits down with that customer, they go through a very specific order of operations in that meeting, and the original list did not follow that. So we wanted to make sure that it's easy for them to just go one by one throughout the meeting, so we reorganized those in that way as well. You can see there's more categories than there were before. That's because one of the categories before was miscellaneous, and it was actually the biggest category there was. There was the most selections under miscellaneous. No one had any clue what they would find under there. So even though we have more categories, now that we're using the words that the users themselves would use for those categories, it's much more clear what they're going to find underneath each category rather than having that huge miscellaneous category. So Through a second round of usability testing, we actually found that the users are now able to find the things that they're looking for, which is super encouraging because if a customer were then to ask them, oh, I heard someone got this thing on their aircraft, they're able to quickly go through the app and find that for the customer. So my key takeaways, test your designs, sometimes more than once. If we hadn't done usability testing, we never would have figured out that this was a problem. So kind of going with that bias and assumption thing, we assumed that the content we were given was good and ready for the users to use. And then consider a card sort when appropriate. Your users also have those biases. So what you want to do is try and design for what the most people think, and you want to try and figure out how they think because it's not the same as how you think. You are not your user. Last thing is listen to your users and the words that they use. So a lot of the time, the words that we use in UX or design or development, the users don't know those words. So you want to use the words they're using, so that way when they come to your system, they feel comfortable and know exactly what you're talking about. Here's how to contact me. Also, we are currently hiring for UX at Gulfstream, so if you're interested in that, please contact me afterwards.
There we go. And that is an official. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you. That was great. And one sort of follow-up note, as I know as Chris gets ready here, is often with this kind of user research that takes place at the beginning of a project, a lot of you who are or in a startup environment think we don't have time for that. We've got to move quickly. Believe me, the more upfront you can do, and you can do it in quick sprints, the better off your product will be on so many levels. It's not just large companies like Gulfstream that have the manpower, that have the money to take the time to do this, and maybe even get in, survey audiences and all of that. It has to be the four-man startup. You need to be able to go out, show what your idea is to people, get feedback, understand if they understand what you're trying to do. So that's my takeaway from that one. So Chris, take it away.
Hi. Any game developers in here? Come on, seriously. All right, so I saw some people that were UX, so I'm going to take you out in the world a little bit, and then we're going to bring this in to home. Starting out, the Proteus effect and user experience. The Proteus effect is you taking on or personifying or embodying the character that you game as. That's pretty critical, because they said that the Proteus effect only exists in the world of virtual reality because of the term embodiment. Okay? Keep that in mind. The video game industry retailed over $135 million, 135 million games in 2014. That's $22 billion worth of profits. That's a lot of cheddar, right? That's a lot of money. But a lot of information that's scattered in that's kind of like lost in the ether. That information is proprietary. For example, I've got up here over 150 million Americans play video games, 56% are male. And if you read in the fine print, that comes from the ESA in 2015. What year are we in? You understand? I'm not pulling up some archaic data and giving you stuff this is what I have to work with, because a lot of what we have to work with is proprietary. So Sony, Microsoft, they keep that stuff in-house and they don't like to share that information. So we have to go to places like Pew Research Center. And Pew says, oh, well, of adult blacks and whites, 51% of their respective populations are calling themselves gamers. Okay, well, what does that mean? What is a gamer? All right, well, scientific papers on ethnicity and racism have virtually no information. If you read across the board through the spectrum, all of the scientific papers say, yeah, we need more data on research and race, and it'd be great if somebody did that, because we can't find it. And if you read through a lot of their intros, there's no information on that, because it's a touchy subject. No one wants to go there. In a survey that was conducted of over 1,100 gamers, 66% said video games need more ethnic and gender inclusivity. Okay. Well, 79% of video game developers are Caucasian, and we can find that statistic. But yet, race and ethnicity is empirically underexamined in games, aside from the whole violent content thing. I'll get to that in a moment. First, what you see here is an avatar, right? This picture, this aesthetic Enzo, this good-looking, whatever this humanoid kind of thing is. That's an avatar. And in front of him in the foreground is Mario, of course, not endorsed by Nintendo. Mario is a character, right? So to kind of lump the two together, I want to talk about DAs as a digital actor or a digital agent. And DAs are representative of either characters or avatars. And they are what you embody when you're in a digital world. They are who you take on or personify. Now what that means is whatever feelings or thoughts or constraints or whatever that you have as an attribute toward that entity, you embody that. That is what you become when you game. Modification of yourself, also modification of your self-representation also modifies yourself. Yee and Balinson did a study in 2007 where they found that individuals, males and females, that played games, they changed the amount of information that they shared when they got to see their digital selves in VR, and they thought that they looked attractive. So the information that you shared and the quality of that information was greater. There was more information shared when you felt that you were more attractive. So embodiment, it really is key. It's key in a lot of things, especially social proximity within digital worlds. And taller DAs negotiate objects with greater confidence. Sales teams, the taller the DA is, the more sales are produced. They're more willing to approach the opposite sex. So what we're finding is that from the digital world to our world, there is a one-to-one replication of yourself. So how you'd behave or how an individual behaves in the real world, that also ties into the digital world. There is no real separation of those two constructs. And we know Ryan and Shabilsky did a study, and they know that 5 minutes of gaming, just 5 minutes of gaming can change your behavior. And with DAs, again, not characters or avatars specifically, DAs embodying both, we can ignore gravity, time, and space, but we're not exempt from social influences. Light-skinned DAs are treated more positively than dark-skinned DAs in digital environments, especially within collaborative virtual environments, which is where meetings take place. And we're just now beginning to understand gamer behaviors. We've had games around since Atari, right? And just now beginning to understand how gamers react within digital environments. So literature is limited on DAs and race. Race is not a scientific category. It's not, it's a political construct. It's a primary principle of stratification in the US, meaning it's used primarily to break apart groups and say you're a representative of group A, group B, or group C. But for centuries, humans have typically classified themselves through phenotypic traits: eye color, hair color, and skin color. Stereotypes are at play when we play. Typically, black DAs are treated as gangsters or athletes and have a greater amount of aggressive behaviors within the gaming environments. Stereotypes within games come to play because we use those as an advantage. It's like a design leverage because we understand that people have stereotypes when they approach anything and everything. For us, we call them heuristics. It's a rule of thumb. Human factors in our world, it's a heuristic. A heuristic is a rule of thumb. It's a guideline that gets you around. That's how you survive, basically. So stereotypes are heavily used in game design. And of course, stereotype activation doesn't necessarily correlate to stereotype endorsement, but games try to thrive on that. So my study that I conducted was using GTA 5. And for those of you that don't know, GTA 5 is an open world action adventure game. You probably see it better here. This is a typical picture of gameplay. It's third person. requirements for play, you play missions, you explore this there is an online construct, but you explore this game in a digital space. And so what I needed was something that was relatable to the individuals that I had access to, and what I had access to were college kids. A lot of college kids play GTA 5. And so I'm just going to skip past that. We'll come back to it in a moment.
Yeah, and to that point, Chris, just knowing the time.
Yeah, time. So what I was looking at is a gamer race. One of my hypotheses was that gamer race, meaning gamer race, wouldn't have a significant impact on gameplay. So for race, I have DAs, and my DAs within the game are black or white. My gamers are Middle Eastern, African American, Caucasian. Okay? That was broken down and identified, and I have all of that information on other slides, but I'm trying to cut for time. So, and what I was looking at, my dependent variables are the crimes that are committed within gameplay. And how I got there, it took months, plus an interrogation room with Volusia County Sheriff's Department, is ridiculous, but you're going to see this. So what I was looking at was race wouldn't have a significant impact because there's no literature that supports that. DA race is expected to make a difference in crimes committed due to stereotypes. And then DA race, right? And then I said skin congruent configurations would have fewer behavioral counts due to the Proteus effect. So these are the crimes that were committed within the gameplay across all races. For the crimes, vandalism, I broke it down into two groups. I have crimes against property, crimes against people. Vandalism ranks in as 78%, murder manslaughter is 79%. Quick disclaimer, when it comes to committing crimes, there's a certain thing called elements of intent. I can't prove that when somebody plays a game. I don't know if they really just can't drive or if they just consciously decided to roll down the sidewalk and bowl over 30 pedestrians. So all I can do is just count the bodies, right? And by I don't count. I have other people within the lab that sit down and watch the video and count, and we do intra-rater agreements. So that's how we validate whether we have a successful metric or not. So assault and battery, 7%, robbery, 14%, but majority is murder manslaughter within this game. Okay, so African Americans playing as black compared to white was where my significance lied. So their gameplay was significantly different for crimes against property and crimes against people across their structures. So, but visually, this is what that looks like. African Americans playing as black and African Americans playing as a white DA for crimes against property. And then the same on the other side, crimes against people. So the question is, well, what am I looking at? Hey, Doc, what am I seeing? That's great, because it looks like Caucasian Americans are kind of all over the place, right? As far as playing as black or playing as white, there's no significant difference. They just game. But the African Americans there's a significant difference between the two. Why? Well, embodiment. Right? When you play the game, you're playing the game. You're identifying as the character that you're playing that game as. Do you endorse those crimes? No. And so what I believe I see is a cultural difference, right? There's a difference in culture between African Americans and Caucasian Americans and the way in which they play games or their approach. And what you see here is a difference in the crimes that they're committing. Looking across the board, crimes against property and crimes against people, there's no real significance when you look at the different groups. This is Middle Easterns playing as blacks, African Americans playing as blacks, Caucasians playing as blacks. They kind of look pretty vanilla. When you go to analyze the data, there's no significant difference there. The difference lies in the groups and what they're playing as.
Chris, this is super fascinating. I feel like I wish we had a little more time to go into this. Is there a way you want to summarize this? Because this is an intense topic, number one, and obviously when you have these role-playing environments where people are free to do whatever they want. It's very revealing. I think it was a fascinating study. This was your thesis, right?
Dissertation.
Dissertation.
Yeah.
Okay.
My thesis was on antisocial behavior within GTA 4, looking at psychopathy and seeing if individuals that are naturally predispositioned to be psychopathic, antisocial, if that shows within their gameplay, and it really does. There is a relationship. So some variables weren't accounted for. I didn't account for socioeconomic status of the students or their parents, right? That's out of my purview. I didn't account for generational position. There was a study that came out. They did a 20-some-odd year longitudinal study in the city of Chicago, and they found that generational status for Americans determined whether or not somebody had a predisposition to committing crimes within America. That it wasn't necessarily socioeconomic status related, meaning first-generation Americans, their predisposition to committing crime in America is significantly lower than a second or third generation. And as you go up in generations, the percent chance that you're going to commit crime actually doubles and triples. So you go from 40% to a 70% by third generation chance that you're going to be incarcerated for crimes that are committed. And identity for gamers is really important. Some things that I would change, I would love to see heat map of game usage, because I also collected personality data. So if I could get this tied into like Adobe Premiere somehow and generate a heat map for where people went when they played this game, it'd be fascinating, because there was a study that was done in Tennessee, and Tennessee said that the most extroverted people tend to live in extroverted cities, cities that afford for extroversion. Miami is a prime example. The most introverted people in America are cities that are designed for and tend to have more introverted kind of things. And the only place that they've found that in terms of psychology and design, that's really like Tennessee. It's mountain communities, and they tried it out on campus and found that people that were more extroverted, extroverted students actually went out and were on a pathway, whereas the introverts stood up on a hillside in the background somewhere on campus.
Is there anything you want to say in conclusion on this? You've opened up like so many doors. I feel like I want to have a conversation about even that last conversation about cities and the character of a city. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure there's so many influences, the urban design, the climate, et cetera, that start to impact these things. Again, Chris has done a brilliant job. He had a question, it became this, and a lot of information is there.
Yeah, my question was, can the Proteus be found in
Yes.
a two-dimensional gaming construct? And it can be found, absolutely.
Yeah, and so this is, I think, an example of someone who's going very, very deep into an environment that is rich with data, rich with a lot. There's probably even assumptions you had to make because you didn't know what the data was telling him. So how does that relate to something simple like, hey, I'm creating a mobile app to find my car in a parking garage?
Listen,
Yeah,
I have a client now that has this product that it's his nest egg, it's his baby. He absolutely loves it, and he knows how his product makes him feel. Okay, but that may not be how it's going to make Susie feel, or Timmy, right? That person, if you want to know how something is going to make someone else feel, you have to go to them with it. You have to find out, and I think that's a huge part of UX. Like it's the usability of that product, right? And it's designing that product to be inclusive for all potential users, right? Or as great a majority as you possibly can. So for a design for a video game, they came out with Rust as a game, and Rust automatically assigns identity and gender, and it upset a lot of gamers. A lot of people didn't like Rust because they didn't have the autonomy or the freedom and the ability to make that selection themselves as to what they identify as.
Yeah, that's great. That's really interesting. I know we only have, sorry Chris, that was fascinating. Again, I want to dive in deeper. I do want to keep some time for the audience to ask any questions. If anybody has a question that this might have provoked, everything from, again, we've got The beauty of UX is that these people sitting up here have a variety and a wide kind of area of inquiry inside a product or service or communication, so they have experience from different places. The visual design, the interaction design, what's happening with the UI, obviously the user research, which we've discussed here. So I'll open it up to the floor, and anybody is welcome to ask.
Okay, we have time for one question. We're really running late.
Hey there. My question comes down to user research, where you're in an environment where you may not have access at all to the actual end user. You know, if you're a stakeholder you're working with a liaison at a department, and you're dealing with your own assumptions, but you're then dealing with another layer of assumptions from someone at this liaison that you're working with, and you're not going to get actual feedback, not really directed feedback from the user themselves. Do you fall back on kind of best practices? Are there kind of, is there kind of UX research out there that gives you general information? I mean, what would be your process in that situation?
Well, I think that it depends on what that is. If it's a physical item or if it's a system.
Website or mobile application?
Hi. I would suggest just doing as much research as possible within that digital environment because, obviously that's where I was, but also looking around, right? Like seeing what other people are doing. Because if they're doing that, there's probably a reason why. But also, there's data. You have to dig for it, and you have to find it, and you may not know how to use it, but you'll figure it out. And just by probing and kind of asking questions and just being really, really curious, keep that in mind. That will always work in your favor, and the people you're working with will pick up on that inspiration too. And it's contagious, and I hope that helps.
I would also add that if you can't talk to the users, talk to the people who know the users. So if you can avoid it, not maybe their boss, but other people who work tangentially or around them. And then also, even if you can't talk to them, if you can watch them work, that tends to help a lot as well, or watch them use other systems and see what types of patterns that you can check from that, even if you're not able to actually talk to that person.
And since we've been given only one question, I'll weigh in too. Obviously, anything you can do, don't ever get stopped by someone going, hey, we have no access to that group. The follow-up question is, well, can we access them digitally? Can I create something as stupid and simple as a Google form and put 5 questions in there? Really prod, and then to Alyssa's point, the ethnographic research, if you're gonna go and observe whatever audience is, there's a lot that can be gained just from some very simple steps up front. So I apologize we don't have any more time. This has been great. Please, I encourage you to pull any of the panelists aside, ask them more questions, since we just don't have enough time. As you can tell, these are always, design is a very in-depth process. There's a lot to be answered. This is just that upfront part, and even in there's a lot of complexity. So thank you all for coming and attending today. And do you want to close up? Okay.
Okay, so we have another session that has been added. It's at 1 o'clock, and it's called Day in the Life of a Game Designer, and it's going to be in the Jolly Goblin Lounge starting at 1 o'clock. Also at 1 o'clock, just as a reminder, we have visual design and art direction for Batman, and that's in the SCAD Museum. And we also have Hour of Code in the Jolly Goblin. So, I'm sorry, Hour of Code is going to be, did that change? Because we got 2 Jolly Goblins. Okay, over there. All right, I hope that you enjoyed the session today. Let's give them a round of applause and take some time to talk to them afterwards. Thank you so much.